The first thing I felt was silence, not the clean, reverent silence of the Imperial Palace, nor the psychic hush of the Astronomican's constant scream, but a broken, irradiated stillness, a silence poisoned by history, where even the warp recoiled in distaste. And when I opened my eyes that had not truly seen in millennia, beheld a sky the color of old bone, and rusted blood, clouds hanging low and sickly, glowing faintly as if the sun itself had been wounded beyond healing, and for a moment, an infinitesimal moment, I wondered if I had finally died, and this was some cruel echo crafted by the dark gods. Yet there was no laughter in the image, no hunger, no voices clawing at my thoughts, only emptiness, vast and mute, stretching beyond the horizon, broken occasionally by skeletal towers of metal and concrete, their surfaces blistered and blackened as though flayed by atomic fire. I rose, or rather, my will asserted itself, dragging my form into coherence on the ground beneath me cracked. Ancient asphalt, splitting like dry earth before a god who had forgotten how to walk among mortals. And with every step, memories flooded back unbidden. Terror before unity, terror during fire, terror drowned in blood and ambition. And I realized with a cold, sinking certainty that this world had known its own age of strife, but without a guiding hand, without a dream of order, only annihilation and fear left to rot in the aftermath. I could feel no Astronomican here, no guiding psychic lighthouse, which meant either humanity was extinct, or it had survived in a state so pitiful that even the warp had lost interest. And that thought more than any blade or betrayal cut deeply, because I had not endured 10,000 years of undeath upon a throne of agony for this. To awaken in a universe where mankind had annihilated itself without even the decency of chaos to blame. As I walked through the ruins of what had once been a city, I saw the echoes of civilization clinging like scars, rusted vehicles fused into the streets, skeletal remains half melted into walls, the shadows of men and women burned permanently into concrete by light brighter than a newborn star, and each shadow felt like an accusation, whispering that this was what humanity did when left alone with its own brilliance. My psychic senses stretched outward cautiously, expecting demons, mutants, anything. But instead, I felt only faint, flickering minds, human minds damaged, fearful, stunted, yet stubbornly alive, hiding beneath the earth like vermin beneath a dying empire. And that realization stirred something dangerous within me, a familiar mixture of rage and sorrow, because humanity yet lived, but it had become small. When the first of them emerged, clad in mismatched armor and carrying a crude rifle that would have insulted even a feral world militia, I felt no threat, only disbelief, as they stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, whispering prayers to gods that did not exist. And when one finally spoke, their voice trembling as if addressing a myth, they called me a walking nuke, a pre-war ghost, a man who glowed like judgment, and none of their words carried reverence, only fear born of old stories passed down like radiation sickness. And I understood then that in this world, technology had become legend, and legend had become terror. As more emerged, I saw the mutations: extra fingers, scarred flesh, eyes clouded by exposure, and felt the long-suppressed ache of failure tighten around my soul, because this was mankind unshaped, unprotected, poisoned by its own hubris. And I wondered if Malkador would have laughed bitterly at this outcome, if Horus before the fall would have looked upon this world and wept. Their leaders approached last, hiding behind masks and titles, calling themselves overseers, wardens, kings of Ashdom, and they demanded to know who I was, what weapon I represented, what faction I belonged to. And when I answered, when I spoke the truth, that I was the emperor of mankind, that I had come not as conqueror but as reckoning, they did not kneel, they did not understand, and in their confusion I saw the true horror of this place, not the radiation, not the monsters lurking in the wastes, but a humanity so broken that even its creator had become incomprehensible to it. Night fell slowly, and with it came creatures twisted by fallout and time. Beasts that would have been purged without thought by the Legiones Astartes, yet here they ruled the darkness uncontested. And as I destroyed them not with grand displays of power, but with precise, weary efficiency, I felt the old instinct return, the urge to rebuild, to unify, to impose order upon chaos, even as another voice whispered that I had done this once before, and it had ended in betrayal, heresy, and a galaxy aflame. As fires burned in the distance and the survivors watched me from behind barricades of scrap and fear, I realized this world stood at a crossroads it did not even know existed. And the question before me was not whether I could save it, but whether I should, because if I stayed, if I taught them again how to reach for the stars, then one day they too might build weapons that could unmake worlds. And I, emperor, tyrant, savior, corpse god, would once again be responsible for what humanity became. and as the poisoned wind howled through the ruins like the lament of a dead civilization, I stood alone beneath a broken sky and felt something dangerously close to doubt, a doubt that threatened to be more lethal than any nuclear fire this world had ever unleashed. When dawn came to this world, it did not bring light so much as revelation, a sickly glow bleeding through radioactive clouds that never fully dispersed. And as I stood upon the shattered overpass overlooking the wastes, I felt the true weight of this place settle into my bones. Because in the early hours, when survivors emerged from their shelters and the monsters retreated into the dust, I sensed something far more insidious than mutated beasts or decaying cities, a pattern, faint but undeniable, like the early tremor of a warp storm that had not yet learned how to scream. Humanity here was fractured into tribes not by ideology or faith, but by fear of the past. And the ruins whispered constantly of machines that once promised salvation and delivered extinction. And it became clear to me that this world had not merely suffered an apocalypse, it worshipped it, clinging to its ashes as proof that knowledge itself was a sin. I walked among them as they traveled between settlements built from scrap and bone, my presence casting long shadows that caused children to hide and elders to reach instinctively for weapons that would never harm me, and I listened, always listening to their stories of glowing craters they called sacred of underground. Bunkers sealed like tombs where ancestors slept in metal coffins, of armored knights who marched beneath banners of steel and scripture, hoarding relics of the old world as if they were holy texts, and with each word I felt a familiar chill, because I had seen this pattern before on 1,000 worlds during the Great Crusade, when humanity mistook survival for wisdom and ignorance for purity. The first true test came when I sensed them before they revealed themselves, disciplined minds wrapped in rigid doctrine, their psychic signatures dull yet orderly, like a choir trained to sing only one note, and when they emerged from the dust in towering suits of powered, crude, inelegant, yet stubbornly effectized, recognized the echo instantly, for though these warriors called themselves the Brotherhood of Steel, their stance, their reverence for machines, their fear of uncontrolled progress mirrored the earliest tech cults of Mars, before the Omnissiah had been shaped into something almost useful. They approached with weapons raised not in hostility but ritual caution, their leader speaking through Vox-amplified filters, reciting oaths about containment and preservation, declaring me an anomaly, a pre-war construct, a threat to the balance of a broken world. And as they scanned me with devices that would have struggled to read a Lasgun S power pack, I felt a sharp, bitter amusement, because once again humanity attempted to measure a god with broken rulers. When I spoke to them, calmly, deliberately, explaining that knowledge was not the enemy, that fear of technology had led them into stagnation, they recoiled as if struck, for my words threatened the one structure that gave their existence meaning. And I understood then that this world's greatest danger was not radiation or war, but the belief that the future must be chained to the past. Negotiations collapsed not into violence but into something colder, more disturbing, as the Brotherhood withdrew to observe me from afar, cataloguing my movements, debating whether I should be sealed away like a bomb or worshipped like a miracle. And in their indecision I saw the same seeds of schism that would one day birth Mechanicum and Dark Mechanicum alike. Night returned swiftly, and with it came the voices, faint at first whispers carried on. Irradiated wind, not the familiar predatory hunger of demons, but something malformed, half-starved, as if the warp itself had grown thin here, poisoned by nuclear fire and collective despair. And when I reached out, further against my better judgment, I felt their minds not fully human nor fully something else, vast and slow, bound together by shared pain and crude psychic resonance. And the word surfaced from the memories of the wastes like a curse. Super mutants. They attacked at dawn, a shambling tide of green flesh and industrial brutality, wielding weapons torn from military stockpiles and reinforced with scrap. Their thoughts a constant roar of rage and confusion, and as I waded through them, I felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only sorrow, because these creatures were not born monsters, they were engineered failures, humanity twisted by its own attempts at transcendence, and every blow I struck felt like striking a mirror that reflected my own sins. When the last of them fled into the ruins, the survivors cheered hesitantly, but the sound died, quickly replaced by uneasy silence, because they had seen the ease with which I ended lives, and power without context terrifies more deeply than any beast. It was then that I felt it clearly, a presence watching from beyond the horizon, not chaos, not Xenon, but something uniquely this world's creation, a remnant of pre-war arrogance, wrapped in secrecy and symbols of false patriotism. Minds hidden behind layers of conditioning and artificial loyalty, their plans unfolding slowly beneath the ruins like a buried warhead waiting for the correct signal. And when the name surfaced, Enclavi, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, because I knew that Phase 2, the face of humanity convinced it alone deserved to inherit the future. As night fell again, I stood atop a ruined monument depicting men shaking hands beneath a mushroom cloud, and I finally understood the true horror of this world. It was not post-apocalyptic, it was post-blessing, a civilization that had witnessed the end of everything and learned nothing. And as the sky glowed faintly green and distant alarms wailed from forgotten bunkers, awakening ancient protocols, I felt the old, dangerous resolve returning. The certainty that perhaps this world did not need saving so much as judgment, and the question was no longer whether I should intervene, but whether this time I would allow humanity the illusion of choice or strip it away before it could doom itself yet again. I descended beneath the surface of this world, not as a conqueror but as an autopsy surgeon. For the true corpse of this civilization lay not in its shattered cities, but in the sealed vaults buried deep beneath poisoned soil. And as the steel doors groaned open before my will, ancient mechanisms, awakening like startled beasts, I felt a chill even my kind should not feel, because these places were not shelters but laboratories, and the fear embedded in their walls was older than the ruins above. The first vault reeked of decay and despair, its inhabitants long dead. Their skeletons arranged not by accident but by design grouped around terminals, slumped in corridors, piled near locked exit sand. As I brushed their lingering psychic echoes, I saw the truth unfold in fractured flashes. Generations sealed inside under the promise of salvation, subjected to subtle alterations in atmosphere, sound and light driven slowly into paranoia and violence, while unseen observers recorded every scream, and my fists clenched instinctively because I recognized this methodology with horrifying clarity, for it echoed the darkest projects of the unification wars, the kind I had buried and sworn never to repeat. Deeper still, in another vault where life yet persisted, I encountered survivors whose minds were warped not by radiation but by ideology bred across generations to obey unseen overseers, to accept suffering as purpose, and when they looked upon me they did not see a god or a savior, but a variable disruption in their experiment, and their fear was absolute because obedience had hollowed them into tools incapable of imagining freedom. It was there amid flickering lights and rusted walls painted with propaganda slogans about purity and destiny, that I felt the enclave reveal itself fully, not through attack, but through observation, cold and clinical, their agents hidden behind advanced armor and encrypted signals, watching me through lenses and drones, cataloging my abilities, whispering to one another about asset acquisition and containment, and I knew then that these were the inheritors of old Terra's worst impulses, men and women who believed survival was proof of superiority, who viewed the rest of humanity not as kin but as contaminated variables to be erased or exploited. When they finally spoke to me, their voices came layered through multiple channels, rehearsed and sanitized, addressing me as if I were another weapon uncovered from the past, offering alliance, offering purpose, promising that together we could cleanse this world of mutants, wastelanders and failures. And in that moment I felt a surge of something dangerously close to fury, because I had heard this rhetoric before from tyrants who believed order justified any cruelty, and from primarchs who fell because they mistook control for loyalty. I refused them not with thunder or violence, but with a simple truth that humanity could not be purified without being destroyed, and the silence that followed was heavier than any bombardment, for it was the silence of men who had already decided I would not be allowed to exist beyond their control. They struck soon after, not openly, but subtly, poisoning settlements with lies about me, unleashing controlled horrors into the wastes to test my responses, attempting to frame my interventions as omens of greater catastrophe. And as I countered each maneuver with weary precision, I realized they were not trying to defeat me, but to understand me, to reduce me to data points and contingency plans. And that realization unsettled me more than open war ever could, because it meant this world still believed intellect could cage divinity. The warp here remained thin, scarred by nuclear annihilation, yet as conflict escalated, I felt it begin to stir, faint ripples forming where despair and ambition overlapped. And I wondered with grim irony whether this broken world might yet summon its own reflection of chaos, born not from gods but from mankind's refusal to learn restraint. The people of the wastes began to change too, their fear slowly giving way to something more dangerous. Hope, and hope, untempered by understanding, is the most volatile force in any universe, for they began to follow me, to imitate my words without grasping their weight, forming camps and militias, asking me to judge disputes, to choose who lived and who was cast out, and with every decision I felt the invisible chains of leadership tightening once more around my soul. One night, standing atop a vault whose experiment had ended in cannibalism and madness. I felt the full gravity of my dilemma settle upon me like a second throne, because if I walked away, the Enclave would eventually rise unopposed, reshaping humanity into a sterile, obedient mockery of itself. But if I stayed, if I taught, organized, armed, and inspired, then this world would march inevitably toward unity, empire, and all the horrors that followed, and the difference between salvation and damnation would once again rest upon my judgment alone. As distant missiles launched from hidden silos in a show of force meant to test my defenses, detonating harmlessly in the upper atmosphere under my silent intervention, I finally understood that this world was no longer merely a curiosity or a cautionary tale. It was a crucible, and whatever emerged from it would bear my fingerprints forever. And as I looked out over the wastes, over vaults of suffering, factions of fear, and a humanity teetering between extinction and tyranny, made a decision that would doom or define this world. For I would not repeat the mistakes of the past by ruling openly as a god, nor would I abandon mankind to monsters wearing human faces. And instead I would become something far more dangerous, a whisper in the foundations of a new civilization, a hidden architect shaping destiny from the shadows, knowing full well that when humanity finally uncovered the truth of who guided them, they might hate me more than any tyrant they had ever known. The war did not begin with declarations or banners, but with logistics, with roads quietly repaired at night, with radio frequencies subtly redirected, with symbols appearing on ruined walls that meant nothing to the Enclave and everything to the people who lived in fear beneath them. For I had learned long ago that empires are not forged by battles alone, but by belief, and belief spreads fastest when it thinks it was born naturally. Settlements that once fought each other over water now shared resources through unseen intermediaries. Militias trained not to worship me, but to protect one another. Scribes taught to record history truthfully rather than mythologize it. And though I never named this growing structure, I felt its weight settle into the world like a buried foundation stone, invisible yet immovable, and it frightened me how familiar it all felt, because I had sworn never to build another Imperium. The Enclave noticed the changes long before open conflict erupted, their surveillance reports thick with anomalies, their analysts whispering about an unseen coordinator disrupting decades of contingency planning. And when their first overt strike came, it was surgical, devastating, and meant to send a message. For they deployed a pre-war bioweapon into a growing settlement, a strain engineered to target radiation-adapted humans while leaving pure genetic stock untouched. And as I arrived too late to save them all, kneeling among the dying as their minds flickered out like candles, something ancient and terrible stirred within me, because this was not war for survival. This was genocide disguised as science. I responded not with mercy but with precision, reaching into Enclave command chains and severing them psychically, corrupting targeting systems, turning their own automated defenses inward. And for the first time since arriving in this universe, I unleashed a fraction of my true wrath, enough that distant observers would mistake it for a natural disaster. For entire facilities went dark simultaneously, their reactors scrammed by commands no human had issued, and their commanders awoke screaming from shared nightmares of a golden figure standing over a grave labeled humanity. Open war followed inevitably. Enclave airships cutting through irradiated skies, power-armored infantry advancing with pre-war discipline, and the people of the wastes fighting back, not as tribes, but as something dangerously close to an army. And as I moved among them, unseen, bolstering morale, guiding strategy, preventing annihilation at critical moments, I realized the most horrifying truth of all, that they no longer needed to see me to believe, for belief had taken on a life of its own. The Brotherhood of Steel fractured under the pressure, some siding with the emerging order in the hope of controlled progress, others retreating deeper into dogma. And as internal conflict consumed them, I saw yet another echo of Mars before the treaty, another lesson humanity refused to learn. The battlefield that finally drew me into the open lay beneath the shattered remains of a pre-war capital, where the Enclave had unveiled its ultimate contingency, a command bunker housing an artificial intelligence designed to inherit governance once impure humanity was eradicated, a machine coldly calculating the optimal future without empathy. And as I stood before it, its logic cascading across my thoughts like a dead language, I felt an unexpected kinship, because it too believed order justified extinction. Destroying it was easy, but what followed was not. For in its final moments it broadcast a message across every surviving Enclave channel, revealing my existence, my interventions, my manipulations, and in doing so it tore away the final illusion, exposing me to the world as what I truly was, a hidden god shaping destiny without consent. The aftermath was worse than battle, for some knelt, some wept in gratitude, some screamed betrayal, accusing me of turning them into soldiers in a war they had not chosen. And as riots broke out alongside celebrations, I understood that I had crossed a line I could never retreat from, because humanity now knew it was guided, and guidance breeds dependence as surely as chains. I addressed them not from a throne or a pulpit, but from the ruins, my voice carried by hacked broadcasts and whispered translations, telling them not to worship me, not to surrender their future, but to take responsibility for it. And yet, even as I spoke, I felt the terrible inevitability settling in, because words cannot erase the memory of miracles. The Enclave fell not with a final battle, but with a whimper, its leadership scattered or dead, its ideology exposed and rejected, but victory tasted of ash, for the power vacuum left behind threatened to birth something worse. And as factions argued over what should replace it, they looked not to councils or laws, but to me. That night, as fires burned across the wastes and the sky glowed faintly with lingering radiation, I stood alone and confronted the truth I had avoided since awakening, that wherever humanity goes, it drags its need for gods with it, and that my presence, no matter how restrained, would always warp the course of history. I resolved then on a path that terrified me more than open tyranny, for I would step back into myth, allowing symbols and institutions to take my place, ensuring that no single voice, including my own, could ever dominate completely, even as I embedded safeguards only I understood deep within their systems. And as the first flag of a united wasteland rose, not bearing my image, but a simple mark of shared survival, I felt both pride and dread, because I knew from bitter experience that every empire begins with hope, and every hope given enough time demands blood. Hope was the catalyst, I realized too late, because nothing tears reality open faster than millions of human minds believing at once that tomorrow will be better. And as the wasteland began to stabilize, as caravans moved safely, as children were born without immediately learning how to hold a gun, as laws replaced impulse and memory replaced myth, I felt a pressure building in the psychic substrate of this world, subtle at first like hairline fractures in glass, for the warp does not care whether belief is religious or rational, only that it is shared, repeated, and soaked in emotion. At night, when I reached out with senses honed over countless millennia, I no longer touched emptiness, but resistance, a thickening veil where before there had been nothing. And it dawned on me with cold horror that this universe, long isolated by nuclear annihilation and despair, was finally becoming loud enough to be heard. The first manifestations were small and icily dismissed settlers reporting dreams that felt more real than waking life. Voices whispering guidance or warning. Shadows moving against the logic of flickering firelight, but patterns emerged quickly. And patterns are how damnation begins. For the dreams shared common imagery of light and ruin, of a towering figure holding back endless night. And though my name was never spoken, I felt each vision pull against me like a hook, anchoring itself to my existence, whether I wished it or not. Cult-like groups formed without my consent, claiming not worship but alignment, insisting they followed principles rather than a god. Yet their rituals mirrored the earliest proto-ecclesiastical practices I had once dismantled with ruthless efficiency. And watching history attempt to repeat itself in a universe that had never known terror filled me with a weariness deeper than any wound. Worse still were the things that followed the belief. Entities half-formed and unstable, not demons as I knew them, but malformed reflections of human longing, manifestations of protection, vengeance, purity, and survival, flickering into existence around battlefields and disaster sites, helping and harming with equal indifference. And as I destroyed the first of these abominations, I felt the warp recoil, not in pain, but in recognition, as if it finally understood the rules of this reality and was eager to exploit them. The Brotherhood remnants fractured completely at this stage, some attempting to weaponize these phenomena, others declaring them heretical and launching purges that only fed the psychic turbulence. And I saw clearly now that the Fallout world's greatest fluid's obsession with control after catastrophe made it uniquely fertile ground for chaos, not as gods, but as concepts, raw and unshaped. Growing stronger with every attempt to suppress them, the people came to me in secret, leaders and generals and scholars alike, begging for guidance, for certainty, for absolution. And though I gave them none of those things, merely urging caution and restraint, my refusal itself became doctrine, interpreted as wisdom too vast to articulate, and I felt the old trap close once more, the inescapable gravity of being more than human among those desperate to believe in something greater. The breaking point came in a city built atop a crater where belief had grown thickest, where survivors claimed angels of light walked the streets during raids and devils rose from the irradiated rivers to punish criminals. And when I arrived, I felt the warp already tearing through, reality fraying like cloth pulled too tightly, for an entity had coalesced there, vast and luminous, born not of malice, but of protection, a guardian forged from collective fear and hope, and as it manifested fully, stabilizing itself through worship and sacrifice, I understood the terrible irony that humanity had, once again, created a god to shield itself from the consequences of its own actions. Confronting it was like staring into a distorted mirror, for it bore fragments of my ideals without my restraint, enforcing peace through psychic dominance, silencing dissent, rewriting minds to remove the capacity for violence. And though the people praised it as a savior, I saw the truth immediately, because peace without choice is merely another form of extinction. Destroying the entity required me to tear open the warp fully for the first time in this universe, unleashing a controlled psychic storm that ripped belief from flesh and scattered it screaming back into unreality. And as the Guardian collapsed into nothingness,